The first time I arrived at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, I ran to the wall that was a combination of smooth crafted concrete and rough travertine. I couldn't help myself as I caressed the textures on the wall. That space felt different, and that wall beckoned me to go and feel it. I could feel it with my eyes, but I had to go and feel it with my skin. It was something that pulled at me. It called me to it. As I continued to experience the museum designed by Louis Kahn, I noticed the louvers that allowed light to pour into the space in a really crafty way that helps the art not be impeded and at the same time helped those in the space feel comforted. The louvers were specially designed to reflect that light and refract it off of the smooth barrel vault concrete that had been made to pour that light gently onto the art. This was an effect that also changed how the building felt. It made the building feel like I was home. The handrail is known as the handshake of a building. And this is a perfect example of how that building too, not only through the other things I've talked about, but even through the handrail, came to me and shook my hand. The building introduced itself. This was a handrail that was crafted in almost a way that made me feel like I could never feel so good putting my hand on a handrail. It felt so natural. It felt like I knew the building. It felt like the building knew me. Fast forward to another experience that I have had at the Air Force Chapel in Colorado Springs. The Air Force Chapel was built back in the 1950s, and as I entered, the experience was definitely not one of the 1950s. I don't think it's one I could attribute to any era, but it was an ethereal experience, an experience that transcended almost anything else that I had felt. As I entered the space, I felt reverence, but I also felt inspired and motivated. The stained glass allowed light to pour in several colored tones and hues, which changed the whole attitude of the space and changed and affected that reverence that I had mentioned earlier as well. The reason I talk about buildings is because I am an architect. But architects don't have the same value that many people may think now in today's day. Those buildings have impacted me, and I know that there are buildings that have impacted each of you. The issue that architects are facing today is that people think that architects only affect buildings on the aesthetic level, that we only change how a building looks, not necessarily how it functions or how it affects those who inhabit it. My argument with you today is that architects do affect the building in much more significant ways than just the aesthetic, and that architects are the ones you should seek out to find an experience like these ones I've described here. Daniel Libeskind said, "There's nothing more important than architecture. It creates your world and influences how you feel, both mentally and spiritually." Daniel Libeskind is the architect of many award-winning buildings. One specifically, though, is the 9/11 monument at Ground Zero, which, as many people know, is an extremely emotionally impacting monument. This is a testament to how architects believe that we affect so much more than just the looks of a building. We affect people mentally, spiritually, psychologically. But this belief isn't something that's new. Vitruvius, a Roman architect, had three main tenets of good architecture, and these are in Latin, as you may have noticed. Namely, he says firmitas, which means firmness or structure, venustas, which means beauty or delightfulness, and utilitas, which means usefulness. I'd like to focus on delightfulness, as I've talked about the amount of pleasure and thrill that I've gotten from these previous experiences. That the delightfulness is the experience in a building, is enjoying the being in a building. I'm going to go through some examples, and I invite each of you to really put yourself into each of the buildings that I'm going to show here. And I invite each of you also to think about how you feel as you mentally inhabit that space. This is the Pantheon in Rome. This is Wells Cathedral in England. This is another cathedral in France. And some more modern examples. This is the Seattle Library by OMA Architects. Here's a piece of the interior. The Salk Institute by Louis Kahn. Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the most famous residences in the world. Frank Gehry, another world-renowned architect, designed the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. He has a statue, a Roman statue, and in an interview, he mentioned that statue and said, "That unknown artist did a statue that made me cry." How did he do that? That's our goal, emotion. The emotion, tying back to my experience with the Kimball Art Museum, also tying back to Venustas from Vitruvius, and tying back again to Daniel Libeskind. This is a common thread that ties all of us architects together, is this moral to design for the well-being, for the emotional well-being of those who inhabit and use our buildings. In recent times, more research has been done about buildings and about the built environment, and in fact, we know that on average, we spend at least 90% of our time in the built environment. Lots of us even more than that, and some of us less, but the number is still high. It's still a majority of the time we spend in a built environment. Because of this concern, psychologists have begun to study the built environment, and there's actually an up-and-coming field called architectural psychology. There's a handful of universities that even have a department that has architectural psychology, but psychologists have started to collaborate more with architects. And in architectural psychology, many studies are being made, and I'd like to give you an example of a few of them. In an article called The Psychology of Architecture by Jonah Lehrer, he talks about a study where subjects are given tasks to do with different colored backdrops. One backdrop is red, and the other black backdrop is blue. The test subjects who were given the red backdrop excelled more in specific calculated problems, and the subjects who had the blue background excelled in more free-thinking, creative problems. On the same token, there were more experiments that Jonah Lehrer talked about, one of those being about ceiling height. And that low ceiling height, again, helped with problems of confinement and limit, and that higher ceiling height helped with problems of freedom and creativity. In a report for the National Parks and Recreation Association by Frances Kuo, she talks about the role of green in our lives. And when I say green, I don't mean green the color. I mean green with plants and vegetation, things like that. Landscaping, nature. In this study, it seemed to me as I read it that she could find almost no bad thing that landscaping did for us. In other words, there were so many benefits that I couldn't fit a quote on a slide for you. She talked about how there are lower violence rates when people have more connection with nature. There's lower rates of aggression. People have healthier relationships. They have healthier communities. They feel more a part of their community. It affects quite substantially the human psyche and emotionally, and it affects their relationships as well. That is another impact that cannot be underestimated, and it plays a big role in architecture. These studies are just examples, and the field of psychology, because it's a science, has very specific studies. And it's hard to get an all-encompassing study of architecture and how it affects people. But one of the things that I really want you to take home today is that architects have been practicing for 3,000 years, and everything I've shown you so far is a result of architecture. That those are all examples of an architect's work. And that architects have been doing this for millennia, and we've been passing down teachings for millennia. We know how to affect people emotionally. And while we may not be able to put it to a science, it's a skill we have, and it adds value. It's not just aesthetic, it is a strong emotional and mental value. Rem Koolhaas says, architecture stands with one leg in a world that's 3,000 years old and another leg in the 21st century. This almost ballet-like stretch makes our profession surprisingly deep. You could say that we're the last profession that has a memory, or the last profession whose roots go back 3,000 years, and still demonstrates the relevance of those long roads today. Initially, I thought we were actually misplaced to deal with the present, but what we offer in the present is memory. That memory ties back to the experience that Frank Gehry talked about, crying because of a statue. It ties back to the experience that I had in the Kimball Art Museum of feeling like I knew that building and feeling like that building knew me. It ties back to Venustus and the delightfulness that Vitruvius wrote about. Martha Thorne, the executive director of the Pritzker Architecture Prize, said, "Good architecture is intentioned. It somehow touches the people who use it and live in it. It somehow touches the human soul. Truly good architecture has the ability to relate individuals in a very profound way. We all know when we experience a quality building or a space that somehow goes beyond being functional and is somehow very special." I invite you to think about the places that have impacted you, the buildings that the first time you walked in, you felt a difference. That is a world that architects have designed, and that is a world that can be in our future. And the future lies in your hands. Architects will help make it, but we need to be a part of the solution. As an architect, I invite you to allow architects to be a part of the solution so that emotional architecture, impacting positive, happy architecture, can be a part of our lives. Next time you think about architecture, next time you think to build, I invite you to think about this question and to think about architects. What impact can architecture have on you? Thank you.